Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our February National Farm to School Network Trending Topics webinar. We're going to give it just a few more moments for folks to jump on the line, and then we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the February National Farm to School Network Trending Topics webinar. Today, we are focusing on reducing food waste through farm to school activities and initiatives. A couple of quick housekeeping reminders before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing in our National Farm to School Network resource database. You'll also receive a link to that recording following today's presentation, along with resources and links shared by our speakers today. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode, so as questions arise for our speakers, please enter those into the question box in your control panel. We'll have plenty of time for question and answers at the end of the session, so please continue to enter those throughout today's presentations. My name is Lacey Stevens. I'm the Program Manager here at the National Farm to School Network, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. National Farm to School Network's Trending Topics webinars are monthly webinars that are open to the public and aimed at highlighting trends, best practices, and success stories of farm to school and farm to early care and education from our partners across the country. So thanks for joining us, and we'll hope you'll continue to join us on our next Trending Topics webinars. So today, walk through our agenda very quickly. We'll give a quick introduction to the National Farm to School Network for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. And then we'll hear from our informative and talented presenters today on addressing and mitigating food waste through farm to school initiatives. We'll hear from the USDA Office of Community Food Systems, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and DC Central Kitchen's Nutrition Lab. And then we'll have plenty of time for you to ask questions of our speakers. So be sure to enter those questions throughout the presentations. So just a little bit about the National Farm to School Network for those of you who are joining us for the first time. We're an information, advocacy, and networking hub for communities working to bring local food sourcing, school gardens, and food and agriculture education into schools and early care and education settings across the country. Through this network, we connect people to resources, people to policy, and people to people in that network building. As you can see, we're truly built on this network model with national staff and advisory board, core and supporting partners in every state, and over 15,000 network members across the country, all working towards connecting communities with local food producers through education and changing local food purchasing practices in schools and early care and education settings. We'd like to invite you to some other upcoming webinars that we have. Next, in a few weeks here on Tuesday, February 13th, we'll have Advancing Equity Through Farm to School. And the links will be sent out. Links to register for these webinars will also be sent out in that follow-up email. We'd love to have you join us for that, as well as our next Trending Topics webinar in March. We'll be discussing engaging farmers in farm to school. We'd also like to invite you to our upcoming National Farm to Cafeteria Conference that'll take place in Cincinnati, Ohio, April 25th to the 27th. This is an incredible biannual opportunity that brings together over 1,000 diverse stakeholders, all of whom are working to bring local food to institutional cafeterias and to foster a culture of food and agricultural literacy across the country. So please join us for this incredible opportunity for learning and taking your farm to school and farm to institution activities to the next level. We're actually currently accepting scholarship applications, so please visit farmtoschool.org/conference to learn more and to apply for a scholarship. So now into our topic of the day, reducing food waste through farm to school. Up to 40% of food in the United States is wasted each year. This astounding number and the financial and environmental impacts of this food waste that we'll hear about from our presenters have prompted interest from governments, nonprofits, and private sectors, all working to find a way to prevent and mitigate food waste. In today's webinar, we'll hear from our presenters about ways that farm-to-school practitioners can be active in preventing food waste in their schools and in their communities. So today we'll start by hearing from Andrea Northrup of USDA. She is the Farm to School Regional Lead in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She's based in Denver, Colorado, and supports farm to school programs through training, technical assistance, and research in the 10 Mountain Plains region states. Prior to joining USDA, Andrea was the Farm to School coordinator at Minneapolis Public Schools. She began her farm to school journey in 2008 as the founder and director of the DC Farm to School Network in Washington, D.C. Next, we'll hear from Ryan Parker of the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Ryan, born and raised in Maine, attended the University of Maine, where he earned a Bachelor of Music Performance and a minor in Business Administration. After college, he worked for Maine Congressman Mike McCoud. Then he worked for a small alternative energy company, where he helped construct energy-efficient homes and install solar and wind energy systems. Prior to joining NRCM, Ryan owned and operated Parker Family Farm, a micro-scale, management-intensive, diverse family farm focused in chemical-free mixed vegetables and heritage breeds. He now farms for family and friends on the land in Newport, where he lives with his wife and 2 children. And then finally, we'll hear from Amanda Dell of DC Central Kitchen. Amanda is the school food specialist and registered dietitian at DC Central Kitchen. She works on the Healthy School Food team that creates scratch cooking farm-to-school meals for 15 low-income schools in Washington, D.C. In her role, she educates students on healthy eating and basic cooking techniques and assists with menu planning. When she's not at work, you can find Amanda growing food on her balcony or rock climbing with friends. So we're thrilled to have these 3 talented speakers with us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you very much, Lacey, and thank you so much for having me on the webinar. I want to put in a plug for the National Farm to School Network, which really jump-started my interest in farm to school back in 2008. So your organization is a powerhouse and an important resource for farm to school programs all over the country, and inspiring farm to school leaders is one of those roles you play. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about food waste and farm to school from the USDA perspective. And just to give us some context here, in 2010, Congress passed the Richard B. Russell School Lunch Act. And that was a law that actually created a farm to school program at USDA. And it charged us with distributing grant funding, providing training and technical assistance around farm to school, and disseminating research and data. So these are the 3 main buckets of work that I do every day as a farm to school regional lead. I'm one of 7 farm to school regional leads, and we have a handful of folks in our national office coordinating this body of work at USDA. Next slide, please. So that same law passed in 2010 also created some changes to the National School Lunch Program meal pattern. The meal pattern is the set of components that schools have to serve in order for their meal to be reimbursed at by the federal government. So what that means is that schools are seeing more whole grains, beans and legumes, different colors of vegetables, and more fruits and vegetables on their trays. And it's all because this law aimed to update those meal pattern requirements to meet the science-based dietary guidelines for Americans. And this was the first time in 30 years that there had been a change to this meal pattern. Next slide, please. Now, with all these changes, we heard a lot of rumblings about the fact that they were creating more food waste in cafeterias. So more beans and legumes, more fruits and vegetables were going in the trash. Well, that was just not true. We saw, I listed here 2 peer-reviewed studies that show that really in the long run, these meal pattern changes did not increase total plate waste over time. Perhaps there was an initial increase in plate waste as students were getting used to these new changes, but definitely check out these studies if you're interested in seeing how the long-term impacts of that meal pattern really didn't increase plate waste significantly. Just wanted to clarify that. Next slide. So one of the main areas of our work is research and evaluation, and our primary tool for that is the USDA Farm to School Census. So every couple of years, we poll all the school districts in the country about how much food they're buying locally and about their food education efforts and school gardens. So according to our 2015 census, which reflected back on the 2013-14 school year, 1 in 5 school districts doing farm to school saw a reduction in food waste as a benefit of farm to school activities. So we are seeing that farm to school programs are associated with reductions in food waste as reported by schools themselves. Next slide, please. So one of our key partners here at USDA when it comes to reductions in food waste is the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency. And similar to how our office has farm to school regional leads, they have sustainable food management regional contacts. Now, of course, they don't match up with our same regions, so you may have to do some digging to find the EPA Sustainable Food Management point person for your region. Just Google it. But those are the folks who we are working at the regional level with to coordinate reductions in food waste efforts. Now, the EPA relies on this great food recovery hierarchy tool. Now, towards the top are listed activities that are the most preferred and have the most impact when it comes to reducing food waste. And then towards the bottom are the activities that are the least preferred or have the least impact in reducing food waste. So as we're thinking about how to reduce food waste, we want to focus our efforts at the top so that we can have the biggest bang for our buck. Now, listed over there on the right are 2 publications that EPA and USDA published together that you can find online and that we'll send out as part of the follow-up materials today. But you can also go to the various, the EPA food waste and the USDA food waste websites to browse through some of the other resources there. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is run down this food recovery hierarchy and talk about how farm to school focuses on these different levels of activities to reduce food waste. Now first, starting with source reduction. We want schools to prepare just enough food, not too much, but of course, don't run out of food for the school lunch or meal service. So some of the ways that we work with schools to do this here at USDA are through good menu planning, what are called production records, so keeping track of what you've served in the past, just good food service training and food service skills. We can also work with local growers to incorporate cosmetically imperfect seconds or otherwise products that would otherwise not make it to market, that would be plowed under on their farm or turned into compost. So how can schools use some of this food that would otherwise go to waste on the farm? And finally, we like to work with both schools and farms to increase their storage capacity so that we're able to properly store food so it doesn't go bad. Next slide, please. Also, when it comes to source reduction, we want to make sure that just enough food is made and all that food gets eaten. So we want to make sure that these watermelon radishes from a local farm on this salad bar don't just get passed over by students, but they actually get put onto trays and they actually go into mouths. So we're all very well aware that school gardens and hands-on food education is proven to increase the amount of fruits and vegetables that students are not only taking, but eating on the school lunch line. And on the left here, I listed a couple of other ideas for encouraging students to actually be able to actually consume the local foods that we're putting out on the lunch lines. Next slide, please. Feed more kids. So the second item on the food recovery hierarchy is feeding hungry people. So schools are allowed to use leftovers in subsequent meal services, as long as they follow the health department and food safety guidelines that they must comply with. You also may have heard of what are called share tables. So after students go through the lunch line and select what they're going to have on their tray, if they decide they don't want something, they may put it on a share table or in a share cooler so that other students can enjoy that meal, enjoy that food item if they didn't have enough to eat. What I'm presenting to you are our federal guidelines. So share tables and using leftovers in subsequent meals are allowable from our federal perspective. There may be other state and local requirements around food safety, let's say, that your school may have to follow, but sometimes those state and local folks like to say that things are not allowable at the federal level. So I just want to make clear that they certainly are, and we'll send out some memos and resources to make that clear in our follow-up materials. Next slide, please. Any school meal food that is not consumed may be donated to a local food bank or other nonprofit. So schools are protected through the Good Samaritan Act from any issues that may arise with donating food to those in need, but this is allowable from the federal perspective. Again, up to that school district to make sure they're following their state and local laws around food donations. Next slide, please. Next on our list is feeding animals. So we're seeing a lot of school districts around the country partnering with pig farms or other farms where they're donating their food waste that actually can be used to feed animals. Next slide, please. Industrial uses is the next item on our food recovery hierarchy. And while these are some amazing composters outside of a school kitchen, I want you to look in the back right where you'll see big bins of used cooking oil that get used, that a company comes and picks up every week from this school district. So, and they use that cooking oil for industrial or energy production types of purposes. So schools can totally do this, totally allowable. Next slide, please. Composting. Many schools see composting and composting education as a part of that food life cycle education that they want to provide to students. So not only can composting be a great educational tool, it can also be used to create nutrients for school gardens and other food growing adventures. And using school food for composting is completely allowable, and it's a great way to reduce food that goes into the landfill. Next slide, please. I would be remiss if I didn't take the chance to put in a plug for our e-letter, which is called The Dirt. On the bottom of the slide here is our USDA Farm to School website, where you can find my contact information or the contact information of the Farm to School regional lead for your region. The Dirt is a great quick newsletter delivered every other week to your inbox with all sorts of great information about farm to school stories, news, and events coming up. So definitely worth the subscription. And Again, it was a pleasure being on the webinar today. I look forward to answering your questions at the end of the webinar, and I look forward to hearing from our next few presenters.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was so informative and great to see that alignment of farm to school activities with that food waste reduction hierarchy. And we've put that link to usda.gov/farm to school in your chat box. So please feel free to access that, find your regional lead. They are fantastic resources, as is the dirt. So highly recommend signing up for that as well. We are so thrilled to be able to continue our look into food waste, specifically digging into this food waste reduction hierarchy as well with our next presenter. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Ryan.
Thank you very much. Is my audio working all right?
Just a bit quiet. If you'd want to speak up just a little bit, that would be great.
Okay, how's this?
That's better.
Okay, great. I just wanted to reiterate for myself and for NRCM that we appreciate the opportunity to share our work on food waste reduction, specifically in schools, with the network, and really appreciate the opportunity. I'll just give you a little bit of background about NRCM. This is the Natural Resources Council of Maine is an environmental advocacy organization. We have 20,000 members and supporters who love the state of Maine and want to protect the environment. And I am, as was noted in the introduction, I have farming background, a policy background, and so this is really some exciting work that we are doing with NRCM to reduce school food waste. Next slide, please. Some of these slides I'm going to go over pretty quickly. I'm usually making these presentations to people who are just starting to tune into this issue. So as was mentioned earlier, 40% of the food supply in the United States is wasted annually. Next slide, please. It costs us a lot of money. It's about $161 billion a year in economic losses for the entire country. That was in 2010 dollars. And that's about $1,500 per year for the average family of four. I just want to note here that this has percolated up into the mainstream consciousness very quickly relative to other issues over the years. It's really wonderful that the Ad Council, NRDC, USDA, EPA are all looking at this because it's a really massive problem. Next slide, please. So in addition to the economic costs, food waste is a huge generator of greenhouse gases. In fact, the biggest source of greenhouse gases are of methane specifically in the United States. 23% of our methane emissions come from food waste that's degrading very slowly in landfills in the absence of oxygen. So that produces a lot of methane, which is about 20 times more powerful in changing the climate than even CO2. Next slide, please. So I just included this graphic. I've seen some different numbers. I think this is pretty representative in terms of the ratios. But by far, the largest sector of society in terms of food waste production is residential households. I have yet to see a single study that disputes that. I think it's pretty consistently been found. Whether or not these particular numbers are the most accurate, as I said, I think the ratios are pretty accurate. And specifically in schools, which would fall under the 10% institutional slice of the pie, from the research that we've done around Maine and across the country, schools as a sector within that institutional framework make up about 1.9 to 2% of the food waste produced in this country. So it's a very, very small sliver of the pie. That said, if you look at it by itself, it's a massive amount of food waste. So we've done a number of pilot studies in Maine with some schools here, and I've also done an extensive amount of research across the country, and the amount of food wasted per student per year is remarkably consistent across the country. It doesn't seem to matter whether it's urban, rural, affluent, poor, large school, small school, doesn't matter what age group. The average student in this country wastes between 30 and 38 pounds of food per year. So we have some slightly more accurate data here in Maine because of the pilot studies that we've done. And we have a more zeroed in total of 36.5 pounds of food waste per student per year. So in Maine, again, we're a Maine organization, so some of this is going to need to be extrapolated or tested in each state, wherever you're from. but in Maine, that's about 7 million pounds of food waste per year. Next slide, please. So the reason that we're focusing on schools, even though they're a tiny sliver of the pie, probably the smallest producer of food waste in the country, is that today's students are going to be the next generation's food purchasing decision makers, whether it be in their homes, at the grocery store, at a restaurant, or on school boards and in dining services in cafeterias at schools. And if you look at the success of educational programs in other facets of society, if you look at recycling, if you look at smoking cessation, when there are educational programs introduced for young children, you can sometimes make really big gains in these problems over the course of a single generation. So that's why NRCM is really focused on working with schools to reduce food waste and to educate our young people about the importance of not wasting food, the morality of not wasting food, the costs of when we do waste food, and also in helping connect these students back to the natural environment. Next slide, please. So this has already been mentioned, the food recovery hierarchy. I do want to say that this is a wonderful framework. We're extremely excited that this, again, has percolated up into the mainstream consciousness and focus, and that EPA and USDA have set national goals for us. Again, this is a framework. This sort of reverse pyramid is a framework for the entire country, and it's meant to be general. But in our experience in working with schools, it's not specific enough because schools don't necessarily know how to translate each of these tiers into actionable items within the school setting. So what we're actually doing is I've written a handbook that NRCM is in the process of editing and producing that focuses on not only the things that you can do at each level of the hierarchy, but also which ones tend to be the most useful for schools, specifically in Maine. But this is mostly going to be applicable across the country based on the research that we've done. Again, these problems are very consistent. But also sort of changing up some of the language and also helping schools overcome some of the hurdles that are thrown up whenever you have maybe a science teacher or a janitor or an administrator or one champion in a school who might broach this subject, and walls are thrown up immediately. So NRCM historically is an issue campaign organization. We have a long history of winning environmental issue campaigns, and so we're sort of attacking this in that realm so that we help schools individually overcome this as though we're engaged in a campaign. Next slide, please. I'm just going to go through each level of the hierarchy and talk about some of the things that that we help schools do. So this has already been mentioned by the previous presentation. We have similar but sometimes different takes on this. Source reduction and reuse, that is fairly obvious to some people. It basically means make sure that your dining services staff is purchasing exactly the amount and type of food that your students are eating. That can be very challenging. And no matter what you do, you're always going to have some amount of waste, no matter how accurate you get. You can't predict everything. Another thing that we like to focus on, though, is that this is basically making sure that waste doesn't happen. So you can have the best records in the world, and most schools in Maine, I believe, have some of those production records going back years, and they look at them when they produce their menus, and it's wonderful information. But if you don't have a long enough lunch period, it's really not going to matter how much what your menu looks like. So there are things you can do, like making your lunch period longer. That, again, is extremely challenging. At least what we've seen in Maine is that school scheduling is a huge nightmare. And if you mention the idea of changing the lunch period to make it longer, you've lost administrators right out of the bat in most cases. So what we try to do is help schools by making their lunch periods more efficient so that students are spending less time in the lunch line or in the disposal line at the end of lunch and more time at the table. And I have been in dozens of schools around the state, and I've only found one so far where there wasn't a single thing I could suggest that they could improve their efficiency. That was a really remarkable place to be. Most schools are doing things inadvertently without thinking about the efficiency of it. That's preventing students from eating as long as they could be. Next slide, please. So feed hungry people is the next tier, and I do just want to put in a little plug from my soapbox that At NRCM, we actually think it should say feed people, because I think this further stigmatizes hunger and food insecurity. And this tier, actually, in a school setting, it doesn't necessarily need to be donated or directed to people who are suffering from food insecurity. In fact, if you go that route, you might further stigmatize a share table. But share tables are actually a great, they were mentioned in the last presentation. They're a great resource that schools can put into place to make sure that students who maybe took something from the lunch line and then they're full, or they took something because the cafeteria staff might not be as fully educated about the requirements of offer versus serve and things like that. At any rate, for whatever reason, students, if the food is unopened and unadulterated, they can put it on a table rather than throw it in the trash, and another student can access that food. So that's great. One of the things that is really problematic, at least in Maine, is that there's that little caveat that was mentioned in the last presentation, that the USDA actually promotes a lot of different versions of share tables, whether it be the food is consumed within the cafeteria, or it's taken back in and reserved in another meal by the staff, or is it donated to a local food bank. In Maine, we have very restrictive health codes. Our CDC is interpreting the Maine food code in such a way that share tables are almost completely prohibited, and we're working on that legislatively, but it's important to recognize that caveat that is in some cases very restrictive. Next slide, please. There's a couple of things that I'll mention. The next two tiers, this one and industrial uses, have the potential to be really great. But in Maine, which is a very rural, very geographically spread out state, these two are kind of problematic. So feed animals basically means diverting food scraps, which is not the same as wasted food, but that's a whole other discussion. Diverting food scraps to livestock usually. And what that typically means is working with a local farmer around the school who may have pigs or chickens or some other form of livestock that evolved to eat human food scraps. So that's a really great option if you're a school and you have a local farmer. It can be very problematic. In Maine, one of the things we run into is that usually you're dealing with a very small scale farmer, maybe even a homesteader who might have 1 or 2 pigs. Pigs are slaughtered usually in the fall here. It's a once a year thing. And then your outlet for your food scraps is gone. So it can be difficult to go through all the effort of setting that up and then have that be lost. Another thing that people are running into in the school setting is that sometimes people are unclear about the regulations and rules about feeding certain types of food scraps to animals, particularly pigs. And it can be very difficult for schools and farmers to get on the same page in terms of what each one is willing to do and what the farmer can accept. So it's possibly a great option if everything works out. I have found that most schools, it's not sustainable over the long term. Next slide, please. So industrial uses, basically in Maine, what this amounts to is large-scale industrial composting, or turning food scraps into energy, usually in a digester. This, again, in Maine, because we're so geographically spread out, is not typically one of the best options for schools. We do have a couple schools in the state that are near a digester, but we don't have the infrastructure yet in Maine to make this a viable option. Because one of the big benefits of reducing food waste from a school perspective is that it saves a lot of money in your school budget, because you're no longer paying to send this really heavy material to a landfill. And that's usually, that cost is realized in transportation savings. So in Maine, we still don't have the infrastructure, and we'd be shipping this material, rather than ship it a long distance to a landfill, we would have to ship it a long distance to a digester. So at this point in Maine, this one still is getting off the ground. We're probably going to get more and more infrastructure, and as it does, it's certainly good. But it's, again, it's in the middle of the hierarchy, sort of towards the lower side. Next slide, please. Now, composting in a school setting is actually kind of interesting, because even though it's the next to last tier of the hierarchy, we actually feel that in practice, composting is one of the best options for schools, specifically because schools can realize benefits from composting that others can't. And that typically will be related specifically to curriculum connections, and also school gardening. So if you're able to set up a successful on-site composting program in your school, and again, we're a very rural state, and most of our schools are not in urban settings and they have plenty of space. So we really try to help schools set up composting on-site so that they're not shipping this heavy material and paying for it, realizing further savings. But if you do that, then you're going to have this great material, and what are you going to do with it? And so what we try to do is help schools create school garden programs, starting out small, but then growing. And this also helps get dining services staff, teachers, and administrators on board because, as was said earlier, there's plenty of evidence, anecdotal and scientific, to demonstrate that when students have a hand in growing food and they're outside in the garden or at the compost pile, they're much less likely to waste that food. I've seen this in my own life with my children who have grown up in the garden with me. They eat things that other kids would probably not even know what they're called. So it's anecdotal, but I've definitely seen the research that backs that up. I think, next slide, please. We don't even talk about landfill because that's pretty much what happens automatically now. So I just want to quickly talk about what this looks like. NRCM goes out and talks to administrators, school boards, teachers, whoever would like help with this. The next thing that we usually will do is set up an observation period where I will go in and just observe a lunch period to see what kind of inefficiencies can be overcome to, again, get those kids at the tables longer. Another thing that we need to do is make sure that schools have accurate data, because when you're negotiating your hauling contracts, you need to know how much money you're going to save to be able to convince the school board to do a composting program. Another thing that we do is try to make sure that students run the programs completely so that teachers don't get overburdened and burned out. And then again, with my farming background, we try to make sure we have hands-on technical advice for getting students to create school gardens and maintain them. Next slide, please. Next slide, sorry. So I just wanted to quickly mention some of the benefits. One of the biggest benefits, obviously, from a school budget perspective is that you'll have less waste, which means you're going to save a lot of money. We do have some evidence of school districts in Maine that have gone to zero sort recycling and started composting or sorting their organic matter, and they're saving thousands and thousands of dollars each year in their school budget. So it's really pretty awesome. The next thing is that you're going to have kids getting outside, having some hands-on experience. The day that I took this photo of these students at these raised beds, the math teacher was actually using it as an opportunity to teach about area and volume calculations. So these were actually math students that were out in the garden. And then finally, these onions on the stairway came from these same raised beds. There's 7 raised beds on this garden. They planted 3 of them to onions, and they produced 70 pounds of onions. This school district has 8 schools in 8 different towns. They're all connected. This was one school, and they produced so many onions that they were able to distribute the surplus out to the other schools that didn't have garden programs. So you can get a lot of really great benefits from having students connected to farming and gardening and producing food. Next slide, please. And again, I just want to reiterate the reason that we think this is so important to focus on schools. Obviously, there's economic and environmental benefits, but these are the kids that are going to be making these decisions in 10, 15, 20 years. So our hope is that if we can solve this problem now through schools, we won't have to have this conversation again in 20 years. Next slide, please. I guess that's it. I just wanted to say again, thank you, and my contact information is here if anybody would like a copy of our handbook once it's done or would like assistance in their school. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's so fantastic to hear all of that work happening in Maine, and really excited about those new resources you have coming out. I was so struck by that photo of the onions lining the stairwell. It's such a great indication and demonstration of really having kids exposed every day, walking through that hallway of what they were able to grow and that connection to food. So thanks so much for sharing that. And as you do have questions for Ryan, please be sure to enter those into the question box. And right now we're going to turn it over to our next speaker, Amanda.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to hear about the progressive work DC Central Kitchen is doing in Washington, D.C. to curb food waste and to fight hunger. Many of the great strategies Andrea and Ryan discussed are ones we are implementing on a daily basis in the schools we serve. Today, I'm going to walk you through the food waste prevention strategies that work best for our organization in the schools we serve. Next slide, please. To understand how we as a nonprofit became a food service vendor for DC Public Schools, it's important to understand why DC Central Kitchen began. DC Central Kitchen was founded in 1989 by Robert Egger when he had a new idea of how to combat hunger and homelessness. His idea was a central kitchen that involved picking up food that would be wasted, turning it into balanced meals for shelters and nonprofits, and using that process to train jobless adults in the culinary arts. Then in 1996, we became a social enterprise company and started hiring our own culinary graduates at a livable wage. Today, 29 years later, we are serving 5,000 balanced meals a day to 80 shelters and transitional homes using food that would have gone to waste. Next slide, please. We have 5 core social venture programs that are shown on the left. They all partner with the community to maximize our impact of breaking the cycle of hunger and poverty. The more food that's recovered and transformed into healthy meals, the more community members we can serve. Next slide, please. These 5 core programs are social ventures that generate revenue for our organization. Our culinary job training program, which is shown on the far left, is the true heart of what we do. It's a 14-week-long program that serves individuals that have trouble finding or keeping jobs. These individuals are taught culinary and empowerment skills with the goal of finding a secure job in the culinary arts. In our Healthy School Food program, we hire as many graduates as possible. This secures a living wage with benefits for our employees and also allows us to work with staff that have fantastic cooking skills. Next slide, please. Although we work to decrease food waste in all of our programs, today we're going to review our strategies and tactics to decreasing food waste in the school setting. Currently, we are serving scratch-cooked farm-to-school meals to 12 public schools and 3 charter schools in low-income areas of DC. I know I'm biased, but this is some of the most delicious and fresh school food in the country. Next slide, please. In school food, we're always focused on how we can increase consumption of healthy foods in the cafeteria and decrease food waste throughout the entire system. The first step to reducing food waste is to create healthy food that kids love. Our students are always hungry at lunch, so if the food tastes good, they will eat it. We will dive into these other tactics listed now. Next slide, please. Food waste prevention starts on the farm. Because our food is scratch cooked, we're able to purchase ugly produce, also known as seconds, from our local farmers. These items will be folded into production and their blemishes never seen by students. For example, we're able to take tomatoes that come in funky sizes or shapes and use it for our marinara sauce for our pasta dishes. This is ideal for us because we can purchase these items at a reduced price, which saves us money. And it creates a new market for produce that would be wasted, which creates more income for local farmers. Next slide, please. Once you have a meal that tastes delicious, you must provide nutrition education to the students so they know why they should eat it. Next, we will review our core nutrition education programs that help us expand the palates of our students and educate them on healthy eating. Again, the goal of all of these programs is to increase consumption of our meals and to decrease food waste in the cafeteria. Next slide, please. Fresh Feature Friday is a unique and fun taste test for students where we highlight one vegetable. That vegetable is prepared 3 different ways, and students taste each kind. Then they vote on their favorite, and their favorite recipe goes on the menu. By preparing the same vegetable 3 different ways, students are able to find at least one way they enjoy, and they feel empowered by choosing what goes on their menu. Some recent menu additions this year have been Hoppin' John black-eyed peas and a lemon parmesan kale salad. Next slide, please. Another nutrition education program we offer is Cafeteria Chefs, and this is one of my favorite programs because we're able to work with kids in a classroom setting. During this program, students learn about healthy eating and then prepare a recipe they're going to see again in the lunch line. The students are so excited to become chefs, just like our school food team, and are more likely to eat the recipes when they see it again in the lunch line. Next slide, please. Many of our students are unaware of where their food comes from, so we have 2 main garden-based education programs. The Truck Farm is shown in the upper right-hand corner and is a mobile education garden. We pull up the truck farm onto the school's blacktop and host lessons for all age groups. If a school has a school garden, we utilize the space and host farm field trips. In the middle picture, our chef at Walker Jones was taking second graders on a vegetable scavenger hunt, and here they're tasting cherry tomatoes. Each truck farm and farm field trip lesson ends with a cooking portion where students prepare a recipe using the ingredients from the truck or farm. We have even added some of these recipes to the salad bar, which has dramatically increased salad bar participation. Next slide, please. We know that schools are all very different, even when they are in close proximity to each other. So we work with each school to find food waste prevention strategies that work best for them. We have a share tables at a number of schools, which is a separate table where students can put unopened or uneaten foods that are saved and served at a later time. And we have found that share tables are most successful when they have support from the cafeteria monitors and buy-in from the school food staff. In addition, all of our schools have compost programs through the Department of General Services. We work with the school to figure out if the composting is going to happen in the cafeteria, kitchen, or both. Next slide, please. Even after our food waste prevention strategies we have implemented, waste still occurs, especially if schools unexpectedly close. Because we use food that would be wasted to create 5,000 meals a day to homeless shelters through a different program at DC Central Kitchen, when we have a school closing, we are able to donate this excess food back to ourselves. So the food that was intended for the school meals can be transformed into meals for the community instead of being discarded. If you work for an organization that throws away large amounts of prepared foods, I encourage you to see if there are any companies like DC Central Kitchen where you can donate your food. Next slide, please. Last year, we made great strides to decrease food waste throughout the entire system. Two of my favorite stats from this page is that we purchased over 82,000 pounds of ugly produce that would have otherwise never made it off the farm, and reached over 8,000 children through nutrition education and community outreach activities. Next slide, please. Thank you everyone for listening about our food waste prevention strategies, and thank you to the Farm to School Network for having us. I look forward to answering any questions that you all may have.
Fantastic, Amanda. Thank you so much. It's so great to see how these integrated programs are working together in DC Central Kitchen to address food waste in multiple aspects. We do have about 12 minutes left, and we'll get started with questions and get through as many as we can. We've got a lot of great interest and great questions coming in from our audience and listeners. So our first question is let's start with Andrea, and then other folks can jump in if they have input. Andrea, you addressed some of the USDA more federally focused regulations around both donating food and issues like share tables. Could you talk a little bit more about where the best place to find regional, local, or state level regulatory information would be?
Yeah, that's a good question. Two state level resources for you. One would be the state agency that administers the National School Lunch Program in your state. So that would likely be your state's Department of Education. And if you work for a school district, your food service director will likely have a point of contact at that state agency who you would be well served to connect with. And then the second would be your local health department. So whether that's a county or city level health department, that's the one that would know what your local rules and regulations might be. And your food service director may very well have a contact there as well, since they're the same folks who do the food safety inspections in school kitchens.
Great, thanks. Ryan and Amanda, do you have any other input on local resources that folks might look to for regulatory guidance?
This is Ryan. I have quite a few thoughts on this. I could probably talk for 3 days about it, also because we're really struggling with Maine's, specifically Maine's rules. But I would say check, one of the things that schools will run into, and we've seen this from a number of schools that we work with, is that it depends on who you call in what agency on what day of the week. And that's really frustrating for schools. You know, I have actually gone through the process of trying to find Maine's specific rules on share table guidance, and I get paid to do this for a living, and I was so frustrated, and I'm thinking, if I'm a school, I would have given up a long time ago because they have other things to do. You might have to check. In Maine, you know, the Department of Education is a great place to check. The Department of Ag also has some interest in this realm, and the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the Maine CDC, that's actually where you need to go to get the guidance, because they're the ones that oversee the health inspections in the state of Maine. And you may find that in your state that's also the case. Some of the best states that are working on food waste reduction actually have centralized websites where people are most likely to look, and all state agencies have agreed on what's on those websites, and one agency will update it and maintain it. That's a really good model. Wisconsin has a really great centralized website that you can go to. If you happen to be listening to this and you're an NGO that's working on this, this might be one of the ways you can focus on helping at the legislative level, because if you're not in one of the states where they are really doing what they can to allow share tables, it can be very problematic.
Great. A lot of great information there, Ryan. Thank you. Amanda, do you have any experience in DC that you'd like to share?
I think they both covered it. You know, we definitely have had some issues trying to find all the right information because there is no one place to get all of the information. But we have reached out mostly to our local agencies and work with DC Public Schools to get some of those questions answered.
Great. Yeah, sounds like a lot of different information, a lot of different places to look. We'll hope that many other states are taking that approach of doing that one-stop shop information resource place. You can see in the chat box, Hannah has shared with us Arkansas's guide that might be of interest to folks. I'd like to start with Amanda for this next question. As you are implementing your initiatives within schools, how do you work with the school food service staff and the administration to get them all on board?
Great question. So there are a lot of moving pieces. One, we work with our school staff because there are employees at DC Central Kitchen. So during trainings, we'll talk about the importance of food waste and reducing food waste in the schools, of the importance of nutrition education and why we're doing some of these programs. And then what's interesting is our first share table came out of a need from one of the schools where we had a parent approach us and say, hey, look, there's just too many bananas being thrown away at breakfast and we want to do something about it. So we included that parent in our conversation with the school administration. And I think that helped the administration, one, realize that there was a need, and two, just give that extra buy-in and for them to say yes and agree to the share table. So we definitely, you know, it's very school specific of who we're contacting, you know, whether it's the operations manager, is it the principal themselves. So just finding that key person that we know, you know, can help us with accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish.
Great. Thanks for that recommendation. Our next question is for Ryan. Ryan, you discussed doing audits with schools, looking at the inefficiencies in their meal systems and programs that are limiting the amount of time that kids have to eat. Could you talk a little bit more specifically about changing those efficiencies and what those inefficiencies look like?
Yeah, sure. So what I'll usually do is go into a school after I've had a number of meetings with whomever brought this to our attention in that school, and usually I'll sit down with administrators and dining services people and whoever I can get involved, because the more diverse the umbrella, the better. And then I will go in and actually, I'll take a camera and a laptop into a cafeteria and sit in the corner. It's kind of creepy, actually, but I do my best to try to make sure that I'm as inconspicuous as possible and that all the staff know I'm there and what I'm doing. And then I'll just sit and observe, and I try to make sure that I'm there well before lunch starts and I leave well after, so I know what's happening as soon as the bell rings to come into lunch, and how long it takes for the tables to be set up and things like that, what shape the tables are in the cafeteria. And in Maine, I don't know what it's like in other places, but in Maine, we really struggle, because if you think about what dining services is trying to do, they're trying to feed a huge number of people with not enough money, not enough time, in a space that was designed to teach jump rope and basketball, not feed people. So most of the time, you don't have anybody looking at the efficiency. So what I'll do is look and see. One of the things that I often notice is that, especially with younger students, teachers and administrators will make all students enter the cafeteria and sit at their tables before they dismiss anyone to the lunch. And that can be a waste of anywhere between 2 and 5 minutes at the beginning of the lunch period. And so what I try to do is make sure that any of my recommendations are, I have the benefit of being on my local school board, and so I can talk to administrators from that perspective, and understanding that we're not trying to dictate to you what you do. This is just some things that you probably never thought of that we witnessed when we came in. And so that's another one. Another thing that it can be very simple. It can be your trash cans are too close to the place where you put your tray, or where the students put their tray. So there's a huge bottleneck there, because most of the time cafeteria staff want the students to pile up the trays in a certain way so that they're all aligned. And that takes, an extra couple seconds for a student. And so it takes hardly any time to dump something off a tray. So what we'll see sometimes is, if you don't have enough space, you get a big group of students right behind the place where the trays are stacked. And then when someone puts down a tray, they turn around and they have nowhere to go. So, those are little tiny things. There's a couple seconds per student, but if your lunch period is only 20 minutes long and you wasted 3 minutes at the beginning not letting anyone be served, and you have 30, 35 seconds to a minute at the end, that's actually a huge percentage of your lunchtime where nobody had the option of eating. So that's kind of what we do to look to see if there's something that they can solve. And it's important to be very understanding and not judgmental when you go into a school, because we really have no idea what they have to deal with, whether it be teachers, administrators, dining services. And it's important also to mention, somebody asked about how you get everybody involved. I think it's really critical that you involve students, because the most sustained programs are the ones that are run by students. So what we say is, your program is successful if the staff champion could leave tomorrow, go to a different school, get another job, and your program continues.
Great recommendations. Thanks, Ryan. All those little things really add up. Our next question is around data and evaluation on farm-to-school program impact on food waste. And I'd like to mention that there is a lot and a growing body of research and literature, peer-reviewed research and literature about the impacts of farm-to-school initiatives, including utilizing local foods, the educational pieces, and those gardening pieces that impact on, as Andrea mentioned, increasing the amount of fruits and vegetables and the amount of food that students are eating and not wasting. And you can find a lot of that research on the National Farm to School Network resource database. You can search specifically for peer-reviewed literature, and you can also search specifically for evaluation tools if you're interested in doing your own research and evaluation. Andrea, do you have anything else you'd like to add on any of that data or research around farm to school's impact on food waste?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in that it's a growing body of research. So we're actually seeing more and more studies published all the while. On the last trending topic webinar, we heard about SNAP Ed and Farm to School, and about a new study out of Florida that looked at food waste and choices students were making as a result of farm to school program exposure. So that would be a good one for folks to check out. We'll be administering the next farm to school census in 2019. And with that, we're hoping to beef up our farm to school and food waste questions because of this growing interest in the link between the two. And the final thing I wanted to mention is, like Ryan said, students in local organizations can be really instrumental in conducting food waste audits right in their own schools. And USDA and EPA just published a guide to student-led food audits, and we'll be sending that out with the resources follow-up after this call.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. We do have just about 1 minute left, and I'd like to give our speakers the opportunity to share with us what is the one thing that folks should do if they're interested in making a difference in food waste. Just if you could give us in 20 seconds that one first step that you recommend. Let's start with Amanda.
If you're interested, I think just look around at your house and see what you can do at home, because I think we all can do something small at home or at work to make a big difference.
Great. Ryan?
I would echo that. Just open your refrigerator and look in there. As a farmer, this is one of the few things I raise my voice to my kids about is wasting food, because I know what it takes to produce it. And I thought I was pretty good on this topic, but then once we started looking into this at NRCM, I actually just went home and opened my fridge, and I was appalled at myself. So even if we think we're doing a great job, this is just the way life has been for a long time now, a couple generations. So just check your own habits and then get those under control.
Great. Andrea?
I would say go have lunch at your child's school or at your neighborhood school. Without judgment, take a look at what's going on, see how much time that last student who goes through the line actually has to eat, like Ryan was saying, and start there, perhaps before you begin to make those recommendations. You want to be making those recommendations from a place of really understanding what that school is going through and what the food environment looks like.
Great, wonderful recommendations. I really want to thank our speakers today. They've shared with us incredible information, and we'll also be sharing with you in that follow-up email a recording so you can share this recording of this webinar out, as well as the resources that our presenters have mentioned. So a huge thank you and a round of applause for our speakers, and a thank you for all of you in attending. Please stay connected with the National Farm to School Network, and we hope that we'll see you on our next Trending Topics webinar on March 1st. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.